It began with whispers. A figure seen in the mist, a presence felt in the dark. Highgate Cemetery, long a resting place for London's elite, had become a magnet for something much, much darker. The newspapers called it a vampire. The locals spoke of glowing red eyes in the shadows. I'm going to take you into the heart of the Highgate Vampire saga, but be warned, this journey will take us far beyond the graveyard gates into a tale of obsession, rivalry, and satanic rituals. Highgate Cemetery is no stranger to ghost stories. Built in 1839, its Gothic architecture and sprawling overgrowth have long inspired tales of the supernatural. But by the late 1960s, the cemetery had fallen into neglect. Crypts lay open, their contents disturbed by vandals. Foxes would skulk through the headstones, and the once impressive and imposing cemetery now showed signs of decay and dereliction. It was during this time that the first whispers began. Stories of a figure, tall and dark and menacing, spotted near the cemetery gates and along Swains Lane. Some dismissed it as a superstition. Others felt a hidden evil was near. December 1969, and a local woman walking her dog along Swains Lane becomes the first to report something unusual. Her usually energetic and fearless dog freezes, whining and pulling at the lead. The dog is reacting to something unseen. The woman feels it too. An unnatural coldness, an oppressive silence. Then she sees it. An extremely tall, dark figure standing just beyond the cemetery gates. One eyewitness reported that along with a companion, he had concealed himself within one of the cemetery's ancient vaults, determined to uncover the truth behind the strange activity reported there. As they waited in silence, a shadowy figure appeared. It moved swiftly among the catacombs before vanishing into a massive vault. Despite a thorough search, the figure was gone. All that remained was a trail of blood droplets leading to a cluster of colossal coffins large enough to conceal untold horrors. A motorist stranded near one of the cemetery gates when his car broke down reported a terrifying encounter. He described a figure peering at him through the iron gates, its glowing eyes fixed on him and its mouth twisted into a sinister grin, revealing glistening white teeth. The figure then vanished, speeding into the cemetery's dark recesses faster than anything humanly possible. Not all encounters took place at night. A man referred to only as Mr. Thornton, a 45-year-old accountant, entered the cemetery one summer afternoon taking a break from his work and looking for some peace and quiet. What he found was incredibly unsettling. He described feeling an unnatural chill as he walked deeper into the cemetery, and gradually he began to realize he was completely and utterly lost. And then, as he turned a corner, he froze. Standing in the path ahead of him was a shadowy figure, tall, indistinct, but unmistakably there. Its eyes burned red, staring straight into his. Thornton felt his energy drain, as though the figure was feeding on his very being. On a cold winter's evening in 1967, two teenage girls were making their way home along Swains Lane, and the street was deserted, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows across the path. But as they approached the north gate of Highgate Cemetery, they stopped in their tracks. They thought they saw someone moving among the graves. At first, it looked like a person standing there, but then they saw something rising from the ground. It was slow, like it was being pulled out of a grave. What they described was something neither fully human nor fully physical, a figure that appeared to rise from the earth itself before fading into the mist. Perhaps the most disturbing account came from a young convent schoolgirl who walked along Swains Lane on her way home from class. The girl claimed to have seen the same tall figure described by earlier witnesses, but this time it didn't simply passively watch or float away into nothingness. It was there, just standing by the gate, she said. I tried to walk past it, but it moved towards me. It didn't walk, it floated. I felt like I couldn't move, like it was pulling me closer. By the early 1970s, the stories were no longer just whispered in the dark. Families in Highgate began locking their doors earlier. Some even avoided walking near the cemetery altogether. What had started as isolated reports was quickly becoming the talk of the town. For many, it was no longer a question of if something was out there, but how dangerous it might be. The figure seen in Highgate Cemetery was not immediately called a vampire. Early reports simply described a tall, shadowy entity with glowing red eyes, but as whispers spread through the community, the term vampire began to take hold. Why? Maybe it was the figure's supernatural traits, those glowing red eyes, its uncanny height, and its aggressive, almost predatory nature. By the late 1960s and early 70s, vampires were everywhere, not just in dark crypts, but on the silver screen. The Hammer horror series had revitalised the gothic vampire myth for a new generation, with films like Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and Taste the Blood of Dracula dominating British cinemas. Audiences were enthralled by the imagery of bloodthirsty, nocturnal predators stalking through graveyards and shadowy estates. So it's not hard to imagine how this cinematic resurgence influenced local perceptions of Highgate's mysterious figure. The timing was uncanny, real-life reports of an otherworldly entity coinciding with the height of vampire mania in pop culture. The story of the Highgate Vampire isn't just about a sinister figure haunting a cemetery. It's also about the people who became entangled in its legend. At the centre of this tale are two men, David Farrant and Sean Manchester. Their rivalry would become as infamous as the entity itself. David Farrant, a psychic investigator and, as the press continually referred to him as, self-styled president of the British Psychic and Occult Society. He was among the first to bring attention to the strange occurrences at Highgate Cemetery. In early 1970, Farrant wrote a letter to the Hampstead and Highgate Express, describing his own sighting of a tall, spectral figure. He was convinced that the entity was supernatural, but did not refer to it as a vampire. Farrant's investigations quickly gained traction, drawing public interest and, inevitably, the press. But Farrant wasn't alone in his quest to uncover the truth behind the sightings. Enter Sean Manchester, a self-proclaimed vampire hunter and bishop of the Old Catholic Church. Manchester publicly declared that the entity haunting Highgate Cemetery wasn't just a ghost, it was a full-fledged vampire. His theory drew from folklore, claiming that the figure was actually an undead Wallachian nobleman brought to England in the 18th century. These two men couldn't have been more different. Farrant approached the mystery with a focus on psychic phenomena, while Manchester leaned into the theatrics of vampire lore, and yet their paths crossed repeatedly as the Highgate saga unfolded. And then came the media. Local and national newspapers latched onto the story, framing it as a vampire haunting Highgate Cemetery. Reports became more dramatic with each retelling, stoking public curiosity and fear. Suddenly, the Highgate Vampire wasn't just a shadow in the dark. It was a headline. It was a sensation. The label of vampire was as much a product of the media and the era it was in as it was of the sighting themselves. But while some embraced the idea of the vampire stalking Highgate's tombs, others had their doubts. Was this truly a creature of the night, or something altogether different? As public fascination grew, so too did the claims, each one more extraordinary than the last.
Legends of blood-sucking vampires have haunted our imaginations for centuries. But some people in London claim that the vampire that's haunting them is not imaginary.
Highgate Cemetery here in North London is famous for being the burial place for Karl Marx. But more recently, it has become notorious for being the scene of a number of grisly discoveries and strange sightings.
In the winter of 1969, a number of apparitions were reported in Swains Lane, mostly in letters to local newspapers. A particular occasion on which the police discovered an exhumed body or skeleton without its skull.
Have you ever seen this vampire? I have seen it, yes. I saw it last February and I saw it on 2 occasions. What was it like? It took the form of a tall, grey figure, and it about 8 feet tall, and it seemed to glide off the path without making any noise.
Nearly 100 people joined in a vampire hunt at Highgate Cemetery in North London early today. They included vampire expert Mr. Alan Blood, who travelled 40 miles to probe the legend of an undead Satan-like being said to lurk in the area. Spectators gathered in the darkness after watching a television interview last night in which a man said he was going to exorcise an evil spirit he claimed he had seen 3 times. It took more than 40 policemen to control the crowds. Curious onlookers scaled the 10-foot wall in search of an open tomb. Several scrambled back frightened and claimed they had seen something crawling in the dark. The vampire expert, history teacher Alan Blood, travelled from Chelmsford, Essex, after he saw Mr. David Farrant on BBC television speak of his plans to stake the vampire through the heart with a wooden cross. Mr. Blood said, "I met Mr. Farrant and we talked about his plans, but really this whole thing is timed wrongly. There were too many people around, which would disturb any undead spirit in the cemetery. Whatever is there must be Satan-like in character." Armed with a wooden stake and a crucifix, Alan Farrow prowled among the tombstones of a graveyard.
Oh, I gave a false name deliberately.
He was hunting the vampire of the Highgate Cemetery, and 24-year-old Farrow told a court yesterday, "My intention was to search out the supernatural being and destroy it by plunging the stake in its heart." Farrow pleaded guilty at Clerkenwell, London, to entering St Michael's Churchyard Highgate Cemetery for unlawful purposes. Farrow told police that he had just moved to London when he heard about people talking about the vampire of Highgate Cemetery. In a statement, he had said that he had heard the vampire rises out of the grave and wanders about the cemetery on the lookout for human beings on whose blood it thrives. Police, keeping watch for followers of a black magic cult, arrested him. He was remanded in custody for reports. Last night, a Mr. Sean Manchester, leader of the British Occult Society, said, "I am convinced that a vampire exists in Highgate Cemetery." Local residents and passers-by have reported seeing ghost-like figures of massive proportions near the North Gate.
While I'm forever explaining this, I am not a vampire hunter. About 5 of us went to Highgate Cemetery with the intention of performing a psychic séance with the entity. We had implements with us, small crosses, small Celtic crosses. I had my camera, I had candles, we had incense. I had a stake. Attached to the stake was a piece of long cord. The idea of that was to try and cast a magical circle on the ground. Inspector in charge of the case, he made a deal with me. He said, "Look, if you just plead guilty in the morning at Clerkenwell Court, just plead guilty. The case will be over without any publicity and that'll be the end of it." And this same police officer then said to the court, I'd said to him, "You wouldn't understand. My intention was to seek out and stake the Highgate Vampire." Because I pleaded guilty to it, all this was being believed.
A man who went on midnight expeditions to kill a vampire at Highgate Cemetery, London, was found not guilty yesterday of breaking the law by being in an enclosed area. Alan David Farrant, unemployed of North Hill Highgate, appeared at Clerkenwell where he pleaded not guilty to the charge. Mr. Geoffrey Bayes, defending, argued that the cemetery was not an enclosed area in the strict legal sense, and it was not unlawful for a person to search for a vampire. Alan David Farrant, 24, of North Hill Highgate, appeared at Clerkenwell, London, where he pleaded not guilty to being in an enclosed area at Highgate Cemetery, and after the hearing he said he intended to continue his investigations and to carry on trying to warn people that followers of the black magic cult were performing evil ceremonies at the cemetery. Mr. Bays added, "It's akin to people spending fortunes looking for the Loch Ness Monster or some other supposed creature."
Just to explain, your garb tonight is not just a sort of modish affectation. You are indeed a direct descendant of Lord Byron, aren't you?
Well, yes, for whatever relevance that has.
Yeah, but there is a sort of... it does have a relevance in that you believe, do you not, that Lady Caroline Lamb, Lord Byron's lover, is a vampire?
I don't know that she is. I've been keeping an eye on her for some time, mind you. But she's semi-suspect, put it that way.
Police who interrupted a witchcraft ceremony in a derelict London house found 2 men prancing naked around a fire, it was said in court today. It was alleged that the men were David Farrant, aged 33 of Highgate, self-styled leading British white witch and president of the British Occult Society, and a Mr. John Pope, aged 21, of Barnet. Both were accused at Highgate Magistrates Court of arson. Reporting restrictions were lifted. Detective Sergeant John Glover read a statement made by the officer in charge of the raid. He said police went to the derelict house after receiving a telephone call. This derelict house, by the way, is one in Crouch End, which you'll hear about a little bit later in this video. They searched all the rooms of the 3-storey building and found the 2 men both naked, performing some sort of witchcraft ceremony. In the room, a wood fire was burning on a piece of metal foil, flames reaching 2 feet into the air. The fire was so hot, police couldn't stamp it out. They had to use a fire extinguisher. Farrant said he admitted lighting the fire because it was cold. Pope said, "We can't have done very much damage." Mr. Michael Bunting, defending, said, "My only submission relates to the tin foil. It shows the defendant intended to protect the house from the fire, so they were not reckless." Both men, who reserved their defence, were committed on £30 bail to the Old Bailey. A man who calls himself the High Priest of Witchcraft will appear before Clerkenwell magistrates in London tomorrow, accused of body snatching and carrying a gun. David Farrant, 28, of Archway Road, Highgate, London, is accused of taking the body from Highgate Cemetery in January. Desecration of tombs at Highgate Cemetery is still going on, an Old Bailey judge heard yesterday. He said he had seen for himself a mutilated corpse in a damaged coffin at the cemetery this week. Judge Michael Argyle, QC, told of this horrible interference just before he jailed for a total of 4 years and 8 months one David Robert Farrant, aged 28, self-styled president and high priest of the British Occult Society, who was convicted last month in the nude rituals trial. Farrant of Archway Road, Islington, had been convicted in 3 trials by different juries and remanded for sentencing until yesterday, pending medical reports. He had been convicted of interfering with a memorial to the dead and damaging a place of interment at Highgate Cemetery. In another trial, he was convicted of interfering with witnesses to a criminal trial by sending them voodoo dolls with pins through the mouth and chest to dissuade them from giving evidence. In a third trial, he was convicted of stealing blankets and bed linen from Barnet General Hospital. He had pleaded guilty to possessing a revolver and 1 round of ammunition. Passing sentence, the judge said of the interference with the memorial to the dead, "The offences involved great offence to ordinary people. You claimed throughout that you were being persecuted, but I think that the evidence emerged that the boot was on the other foot. You proceeded quite regardless of the feelings of the ordinary people." A High Court hearing involving accounts of midnight witchcraft rites, cat sacrifice, voodoo dolls with pins stuck in them, and ritualistic sex proved too much for a woman juror yesterday. Mr. Justice Cantley excused her from the remainder of the trial after she became unwell as the former general foreman of Highgate Cemetery, Mr. William Law, told of vaults being broken into and coffins' remains being disturbed. It was the 3rd day of the hearing in which the occultist David Farrant claims he was libelled by the Daily Express. Rock singer Long John Baldry told a High Court libel case jury yesterday how he became a target for witchcraft. He described how he received 2 voodoo dolls of himself in miniature coffins. Mr. Baldry was giving evidence for the Daily Express in its defence to a damages action brought by occultist David Farrant. Mr. Farrant, president of the British Occult Society, claims he was libelled. In a newspaper article which appeared in the newspaper following his conviction at the Old Bailey in 1974 on charges of interfering with a memorial at Highgate Cemetery, London, and breaking into catacombs and interfering with the remains of a body. Mr. Baldry, who was quoted in one of the articles, said he became caught up in witchcraft after hearing about the sacrifices of a tabby cat which he thought was one of his pets. His public outburst over this killing led him to receiving the 2 voodoo dolls, each with a photograph of himself attached to the head, and each punctured by pins and nails. He also received a warning written in Chaucerian English that he was interfering with a witch's coven. Mr. Baldry said that Graham Bond, a pianist and saxophonist, carried out an exorcism ceremony to destroy the dolls and get rid of any evil spirits or bad forces.
I became a perfect target for the popular press. I became a kind of story one could read in bed on a Sunday morning.
Vampires. Now, Sean Manchester, the Reverend Sean Manchester, welcome to Into the Night. But you've seen vampires.
Oh yes. I'm talking about a supernatural entity, a demonic form which is born of the devil. Indeed, the devil's undead.
What did the Highgate Vampire involve and look like?
Well, the Highgate Vampire, when I first looked upon it in its tomb in the Lebanon Circle in the center of the old Highgate Cemetery, looked like, I suppose, a 3-day-old corpse.
What made you think it was a vampire and not just a 3-day-old corpse?
Because it could leave its tomb without displacing anything. It could manifest.
Did you see it doing that?
It was witnessed by many residents, passers-by, by many people in the general area.
To cut a long story short, you dispatched this to eternal peace.
It relocated to a neo-Gothic derelict mansion in the same area, and I used the ancient and approved method to release the demon.
Did you put a stake through its heart as well?
Yes, to be on the safe side.
The man caught lurking amongst the graves was David Farrant. He's always maintained his innocence and that the grave desecration was done by loonies attracted by the publicity in the original case. He doesn't believe in vampires in the Hammer horror sense. He believes they are evil, ghostly entities. His rival is the Reverend Sean Manchester, a self-professed bishop of the Old Catholic Church, who claims to be a true vampire hunter who killed the Highgate Vampire with a stake through the heart. Manchester has offered to exorcise him and regularly challenges him to an occult duel.
For decades, the rivalry persisted. Each man published books defending his version of events. Manchester insisted that he had slain the vampire in 73, driving a stake through its heart. Farrant countered this by saying that no such creature actually ever existed. Rather, it was a psychic entity. To this day, the Highgate Vampire story is as much about these figures as it is about the alleged entity itself. Their feud became the stuff of legend, ensuring that the mystery of Highgate Cemetery would never truly rest in peace. But what might this entity have been? A ghost? A demon? A figment of overactive imagination fueled by folklore? Or something else entirely? To truly grapple with this mystery, we've got to try and put aside the concept of vampire and try to look at this a little bit differently. Some have suggested that the figure seen at Highgate Cemetery was not a conscious being, but a residual haunting, a psychic imprint left by centuries of grief and death. The cemetery, with its long history of tragic tales, might act as a kind of sponge that soaks up this type of emotional energy. Perhaps the Highgate entity is a guardian, being bound to protect the cemetery from desecration. Such entities appear in folklore worldwide. They're often described as menacing figures that ward off intruders. But why then would this one appear so sinister? Maybe it could have been corrupted, its purpose twisted by years of black magic rituals taking place there. Some accounts describe the entity as malevolent, a predator feeding on the energy of the living. Could it have been a demon summoned by occult practices and bound to the cemetery? Or perhaps an elemental spirit tied to the land itself, awakened or enraged by the disturbances of those modern times? Several witnesses reported feeling drained, physically and emotionally, after encountering this thing. This has led to speculation that the Highgate figure was an energy vampire, not a blood-drinking monster from the movies, but a being that feeds on life force. Could it have been a product of the human mind? In a time when vampire films dominated cinema and supernatural stories were filling the tabloids, belief itself might have given rise to the entity. A thought form, born from fear and fascination, taking on a life of its own. David Farrant did delve into the concept of tulpas, or thought forms, as part of his broader investigation into the paranormal and the Highgate entity. His interest in the topic reflected a deeper, theoretical exploration of how human consciousness and belief might manifest phenomena in the physical world. As the saga spiralled further into the bizarre, its dark tendrils seemed to reach beyond the cemetery. Among the most chilling accounts is the connection to Crouch End, a quiet neighbourhood with its own share of strange and shadowy stories. It was here, in a house whispered to be known as the House of Dracula, that the Highgate entity was said to have met its end. According to accounts, Sean Manchester tracked the vampire to this very location. Armed with a wooden stake and holy water, he confronted the entity in its lair. The story tells of a fierce struggle, culminating in the destruction of the vampire. Manchester reportedly drove a stake through its heart, banishing the creature once and for all. Some say the entity disintegrated into ash. Others claim it burst into flames and dissolved into a sinister, unearthly mist.
I did not impale a vampire in Highgate Cemetery. I impaled it when it relocated to unconsecrated ground.
I wanted to be absolutely certain that the Highgate Vampire wouldn't rise again.
And did it?
Having missed the opportunity once when I viewed it in its tomb.
Did it rise again?
Not after the exorcism at the Gothic mansion.
What happened after cremation? Did it sort of dissolve into some strange miasma, or...?
Yes. It very quickly fell into the condition that it ought by right be, which is dust.
In front of your very eyes?
Yes, and what remained was consumed in flames.
Whilst Highgate Cemetery remained the epicentre of the saga, this dramatic chapter in Crouch End added a final theatrical flourish to the tale. Was this the true end of the Highgate Vampire, or merely another twist in an already tangled web of supernatural lore? By now, you've heard the key points of the Highgate Vampire saga. The chilling sightings, the tales of dark rituals, the fierce rivalry between Sean Manchester and David Farrant. But what makes this story truly fascinating isn't just the entity itself, it's the sheer volume of perspectives and twists and, let's face it, the larger-than-life personalities that surround it. If you've found yourself drawn into this tale, you're not alone. The Highgate Vampire has inspired countless books, articles, and even documentaries. David Farrant chronicled his experiences in books which were as much a window into his mind as they are into the events at Highgate. Sean Manchester's works, including The Highgate Vampire, offer a strikingly different perspective, equally compelling, if not a little more theatrical. Beyond that, there are forums, fan sites, Wikipedia pages dedicated to unravelling, or perhaps deepening, the mystery, each source adding a new layer to the story, but also raising more questions. Who's telling the truth here? Where do fact and fiction blur? And what exactly is lurking in the shadows of Highgate Cemetery? So if this story's captured your imagination, don't stop here. Follow the trail, read the books, visit the websites, and immerse yourself in the chaos of the conflicting accounts. Whether you believe the Highgate Vampire was a supernatural menace, a thought form, or just a case of media hysteria, one thing's for certain, it's a story that refuses to stay dead and buried. As I close my own chapter on the Highgate Vampire, I can't help but reflect on the peculiar world it inhabits. This isn't just a story about a supernatural entity. It's a tale about people, their beliefs, rivalries, and their unrelenting drive to uncover the unknown. It's a world I'm familiar with. Once upon a time, I found myself in the company of those who claim to possess psychic powers, chasing mysteries and testing the boundaries of reality. And if there's one thing I can tell you from that, it's this. The paranormal draws people like moths to a flame. Some are genuine seekers of the truth, but many, well, Let's just say that they are as curious as the phenomena they investigate. Highgate's story is no exception. It's populated with characters larger than life, each bringing their own eccentricities and sometimes their own agendas to the table. In April of 2019, David Farrant passed away. He left behind a legacy that was as polarising as it was fascinating. To some, he was a genuine investigator of the unknown, a man willing to confront what others feared. To others, he was a provocateur, a self-made mystic navigating a dark world of shadows. But whatever their opinions of him might be, his passion for exploring life's mysteries was undeniable. So if you find yourself compelled to explore this rabbit hole, let me offer a word of warning here. Keep your feet firmly on the ground. The world of the supernatural can be intoxicating. It promises answers to the unanswerable questions. It promises connections to the unseen. But it has a way of pulling you in deeper than you might expect. By all means, stay curious, but keep your wits about you.
It's up to you to decide whether it's fact or whether it's fiction. Sleep very soundly tonight.